It was supposed to be a love story, the kind that blossoms only in dreams or old romance novels. A young girl swept into the whirlwind of an impossible romance. Caroline had just turned 15, barely old enough to understand the world, let alone love, when she met him. Babis, a man of mystery and allure, an experienced pilot, a figure of confidence. Twice her age, yes, but Caroline only saw the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her, as if she was the only one who mattered in his world. Friends warned her, family pleaded. They said it was all too fast, that she was too young, that she didn't know the life she was leaving behind. But to Caroline, those warnings were just voices lost in the background. All she saw was a future with him, a life of adventure, of love, of promises whispered in moonlight. They moved in together within months, and Caroline slipped seamlessly into Babis's world. Every day felt like a secret rendezvous, like the rush before takeoff. Babis took her flying, soaring above the earth, showing her the world from his perspective. "It's just you and me up here," he'd whisper, his hand covering hers on the throttle. She believed him. But as the days turned into months, and the honeymoon glow began to fade, small cracks began to appear. Little things she dismissed, things he would explain away with a quick smile or a reassuring word. But sometimes his hand would tighten around her wrist a little too hard. His tone would chill the air. His eyes would darken in ways that didn't feel quite right. She pushed those thoughts down, blaming herself for overthinking, for not being able to hold on to the dream that had been promised. Then, the doors of their world began to close in. Babis's once charming attentiveness began to feel like surveillance. He asked about her friends, her texts, her social media posts, her clothes, her every move. She was his little dove, he'd say. She was fragile, and the world was a dangerous place. "I only want to protect you, Caroline." But it was in those quiet moments when Babis wasn't around that she began to feel something else, something that clawed at her chest, something she couldn't name. She began to see herself, alone in a vast, empty house, trapped in a world she no longer recognized. And Babis was no longer the hero who'd promised her the world. He was a stranger who held her life in his hands, and she began to wonder if he'd ever really been the man she thought he was. Every night she'd lay in bed, her mind spinning with questions. How had it all gone wrong? Why couldn't she see a way out? And, worst of all, what would Babis do if he sensed she wanted to leave? One day she'd find her answer. But as she lay awake, her heart pounding in the darkness, she had no idea that the story she thought was a fairy tale would soon twist into something far darker than she'd ever imagined. May 11th, 2021 began like any other night in the quiet suburbs, a neighborhood where doors remained unlocked, where nothing unusual ever happened. But in the early hours, long before dawn, a darkness settled over the Anopolis home, a silence so thick it felt as if the air itself was holding its breath. Babis Anopolis was deep in sleep, unaware that anything was amiss. He drifted off beside Caroline, feeling secure in the sanctuary they built together. But as the clock edged toward 4 a.m., a faint sound stirred him, something almost imperceptible, a muffled thud, the creak of a floorboard. In the haze between dreams and waking, his mind dismissed it as a figment of sleep. Then he heard it again. This time he sat bolt upright. His instincts, sharpened from years as a pilot, kicked in. He scanned the darkness, his pulse quickening. The sound was too controlled, too deliberate, as though someone or something was trying not to be noticed. In the shadows, 3 figures emerged, blending seamlessly into the night. Their faces obscured under dark hoods, their movements slow and practiced. They moved with a confidence that suggested they'd planned every step, anticipated every turn. Caroline was still asleep beside him, oblivious to the silent invasion creeping closer. Babis's mind raced. His heart thundered in his chest as he took stock of his options, his breaths quickening, each one louder in his own ears. He thought of waking Caroline, of alerting her to the intruders lurking in the shadows, but something told him that any sudden movement could be a fatal mistake. One of the masked figures stopped near the doorway, head cocked, as if listening for the slightest sound. For a moment, Babis could see nothing but their eyes, a piercing gaze beneath the hood, eyes that seemed to cut through the dark and lock onto him with a silent menace. Then came a chilling whisper, barely audible, one of them signaling to the others. Babis couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, cold, controlled, a voice devoid of emotion. He felt a surge of dread, a sinking realization that this was no ordinary break-in. These intruders hadn't come to steal, they'd come for something else, something far more sinister. He felt Caroline shift beside him, a small, sleepy murmur escaping her lips, and his heart plummeted. She was waking up. The figures froze, every muscle in their bodies tensing. Babis held his breath, praying she wouldn't open her eyes, praying they hadn't noticed. But they had. When Babis Anopolis recounted the events of that horrific night, his words were thick with anguish, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He told the authorities how he'd done everything in his power to protect Caroline and their newborn daughter. How he'd fought, clawed, and struggled against masked intruders who'd invaded their home in the dead of night. He painted the scene in brutal detail: 3 men, masked and ruthless, their faces hidden but their intent clear. They came out of nowhere, he'd said, his voice breaking. They tied me up, beat me. I could hear Caroline screaming. I fought, I tried, but there was nothing I could do. The story gripped the nation instantly. Greece, a country that held its family values close, was rocked by the tale of a young wife, brutally murdered in her own home. The media latched onto the story, calling it a tragedy that had shattered a family and scarred a peaceful community. In days, the story spread far beyond the borders of Greece, reaching international headlines. Reporters stood outside the Anopolis home, sharing every update with a captivated public, who grieved alongside Babis for the young mother whose life had been so violently taken. But it wasn't just grief that gripped Greece, it was fear. If such a tragedy could unfold in a quiet neighborhood, could anyone truly be safe? Parents held their children tighter. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. Babis, with his sorrowful eyes and his broken voice, became a figure of sympathy, a symbol of what it meant to lose everything in a single, horrifying night. Days turned into weeks, and Babis's story only grew more tragic, more haunting with each retelling. He shared memories of Caroline, how she had laughed, the way she'd looked at their daughter with eyes full of love. The public rallied around him, offering condolences, support, anything they could to ease his unimaginable pain. But as investigators began to sift through the pieces of that night, small details emerged that didn't quite add up. The evidence was puzzling. The intruders seemed to have left no trace, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. The neighbors hadn't heard a single sound. And as one investigator whispered to another, certain injuries didn't seem to match the struggle Babis had described. But the public saw none of this. They saw a man heartbroken and alone, who had fought for his family and lost everything. They saw a grieving husband, a father clutching his infant daughter, and they mourned with him. And as Babis continued to tell his story, some people began to wonder, was he the shattered husband he appeared to be, or was there something else hiding beneath the surface? Babis Anopolis became a household name, a tragic hero draped in grief. Every photograph captured him with a hollow stare, his face a portrait of anguish as he clutched his infant daughter close to his chest. News anchors spoke his name with sympathy, sharing tearful clips of his story: the loving husband, who had lost everything in a brutal attack, the devoted father left to raise his child alone. People across Greece sent letters, gifts, even donations, pouring out their sympathy for the man who seemed to embody resilience in the face of unfathomable loss. The media crowned him a hero, a survivor of a tragedy that had shaken the entire nation. He became a symbol, a reminder of life's fragility and the unpredictable cruelty of fate. As days passed, his story spread even further, and the world mourned with him. But behind closed doors, away from the cameras, away from the prying eyes of the public, Babis's demeanor would change. Those close enough to see him up close, the neighbors, the detectives, even his own family, started to notice something unsettling. His sorrow was there, but it was calculated, almost rehearsed, like a mask he slipped on and off at will. A haunted look would come over his face, one that chilled even the officers assigned to his case. And then there were the whispers, rumors that floated in hushed conversations, things only hinted at. Detectives with a sharp eye noticed the small inconsistencies in his story, pieces that didn't quite fit, details that felt carefully crafted rather than remembered. But no one dared question him directly. Who would challenge the grieving husband, the father who'd lost his beloved wife? Yet under the hero's mask lay a secret, a truth so dark, so twisted that even Babis himself knew it could never see the light of day. Each time he stepped in front of a camera, each tear he let fall, he knew he was holding a fragile web together. He had spun his story with threads of sympathy, tugging at the hearts of millions, while hiding the one thing he feared the world might one day discover. For as much as Babis appeared to be the grieving husband, there was a side to him that was something else entirely, something far colder, something that had calculated every step of this tragedy long before the first tear was shed. And with each passing day, the walls around his secret grew thinner. The media, the public, even his closest allies were left in the dark. But Babis knew, and he knew, too, that if anyone uncovered the truth, his story would unravel in an instant. And when it did, the world would finally see Babis Anopolis not as the hero he claimed to be, but as something much darker. As investigators combed through the evidence, a faint shadow of doubt began to cloud the narrative that had once seemed so airtight. Babis's story was moving, heartbreaking even, but some things didn't quite add up. At first, they dismissed their concerns as paranoia. After all, grief could twist memories, blur details, and distort events. But the small inconsistencies soon grew too big to ignore. One detective, while reviewing the crime scene photos, noticed something peculiar about the knots binding Babis's wrists. They were intricate, precise, almost professional knots, so complex that only someone with specific training or an exceptional skill with rope could have tied them. And yet somehow, Babis had managed to free himself after the supposed attack. For anyone else, it might have been shrugged off. But Babis was no ordinary man. He was a pilot, a profession that demanded calm under pressure, attention to detail, and yes, a knowledge of knots. Then there was the security footage, or rather, the lack of it. In a neighborhood with SECT cameras on nearly every corner, there were no signs of suspicious activity, no images of masked intruders lurking in the shadows, nothing to suggest a break-in had occurred. The supposed intruders had left no trace, not even a fingerprint, despite Babis's claim that a violent struggle had unfolded in the quiet home. And the most damning evidence of all, the silent witness no one could dispute, was Caroline's smartwatch. Detectives learned that it had recorded her final moments with eerie precision, capturing not just her heart rate but the exact moment it flatlined. The time of death it marked was different from the timeline Babis had given them. It didn't align with the version of events he'd told the authorities, the desperate, helpless struggle he claimed had unfolded that night. A quiet tension spread among the detectives as they pored over each piece of evidence. They began to question every detail, every tear Babis had shed in front of the cameras, every tremble in his voice as he described the horrors of that night. Was it genuine grief they'd seen, or the performance of a man who had calculated every aspect of his story down to the last minute? The case that had once seemed so clear now felt shrouded in doubt, every piece of evidence hinting at a story no one had dared consider. And as the investigators continued their work, they knew that this was only the beginning. Babis's carefully constructed tale was beginning to fray, thread by thread, and they were close, so close to uncovering what lay beneath the mask. As investigators dug deeper into Caroline's life, a new, unexpected source of insight emerged: her diary. Bound in faded leather and hidden among her belongings, it looked unassuming, a private collection of thoughts and reflections. But as they flipped through its pages, the detectives realized that this diary might be the most telling evidence of all. In the weeks leading up to her death, Caroline had poured her thoughts onto its pages, confiding her deepest fears and suspicions. What started as innocent entries about her daily life slowly shifted, revealing glimpses of unease that evolved into raw, unsettling fear. She wrote about the man she had once loved so intensely, a man she'd sacrificed everything for, leaving behind her family, her friends, her innocence. But now, in the quiet of their home, Caroline felt the dark shadows that lurked behind Babis's charming smile. One entry stood out, a passage where Caroline described a sudden change in Babis's demeanor. "I don't recognize him anymore," she had written, her handwriting shaky. "His eyes look at me like I'm not even there, like he's somewhere far away. It's as if there's a wall between us, something he doesn't want me to see." She wrote about strange occurrences, how he'd disappear at odd hours without explanation, how his warmth had given way to an icy distance. She wrote of the silence, the oppressive feeling that settled over their home, the growing unease that had made her feel like a stranger in her own life. Caroline's fear bled through the ink as she documented the arguments, his flashes of anger, his unsettling silence that would stretch for days. And in one of her final entries, Caroline voiced the deepest of her fears. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a stranger," she had scrawled, her words barely legible, as though she'd written them in a rush. "I don't know if I'm safe. I don't know if our daughter is safe. The detectives read each word in silence, the weight of her fear pressing down on them like a lead weight. Her words painted a chilling picture, one that hinted at a darkness lurking just below the surface. A darkness she'd sensed, but couldn't name. Caroline had felt trapped, her diary becoming the only place where she could be honest, where she could voice the terror that she couldn't say out loud. In that small book, Caroline's last pleas for help lingered, haunting and unfinished. Each page was a silent cry, a warning that had gone unheard until now. With every entry they read, the investigators felt the narrative shift. Caroline's diary spoke to them from beyond, revealing a side of Babis that his public face had hidden so well. The man the world saw as a grieving husband was now cast in an entirely different light, a light that illuminated secrets he tried to bury. And as the final words of her diary echoed in their minds, one thing became terrifyingly clear: this was never a tragic love story gone wrong. It was something far more sinister, something that had taken root long before that fateful night. In a dimly lit room lined with case files and evidence boards, the investigators sat in stunned silence, the weight of realization settling over them like a dark cloud. With each new detail, each piece of evidence meticulously assembled, the truth had come into focus. What had once appeared to be a tragic home invasion was in fact a carefully orchestrated deception, a twisted play in which Babis himself had cast the roles and set the stage. From the beginning, his story had held the nation captive: the grieving husband, the brutal attack, the senseless murder of a young mother. Babis had painted himself as a hero, a man who had fought for his family and lost everything. But as the investigators examined each detail through a new lens, the tragic portrait began to shift, revealing something far darker. The knots binding his wrists, so intricate, so precise, were no longer a mystery. They hadn't been tied by masked intruders, they had been tied by a man who knew exactly how to create an illusion. The absence of forced entry was not a lapse in the intruder's plan. It was a deliberate choice, one made by someone who had keys to every lock, knowledge of every room, and familiarity with every blind spot. The chilling timeline recorded on Caroline's smartwatch told a story of its own, a timeline that placed her death hours before the supposed intruders arrived. It painted Babis not as a helpless victim, but as the architect of the horror that had unfolded in that house. And Caroline's diary, her private fears scrawled in ink, had revealed the darkness she had sensed, the creeping dread that had filled her final days. The investigators reviewed their findings with grim determination. Babis had crafted an elaborate ruse, playing the role of a grieving husband while concealing the truth that he had planned Caroline's death, had calculated every step to avoid suspicion, and had woven his story to evoke sympathy from the world. But his perfect lie had frayed, its threads unraveled by the silent witnesses he hadn't anticipated: the knots, the footage, the smartwatch, and Caroline's own words. As they prepared to confront him, the detectives knew they were about to shatter the illusion he had so carefully built. The man who had once stood before cameras, weeping for his lost wife, would now face justice, stripped of the mask he had worn so convincingly. The pieces had fallen into place, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, the truth was clear. This was not the story of a tragic love, but a betrayal, premeditated and cold. And Babis Anopolis, the man who had captivated a nation with his grief, was about to face the consequences of his deceit. In the end, the truth came crashing down like a house of cards, revealing Babis Anopolis for who he truly was. The man who had once enchanted the world with his heartbreak, the man whose grief had touched the souls of strangers, was nothing more than an illusion, a hollow shell constructed to hide a sinister core. The FBI, the press, and the public had all fallen for his story, blinded by the carefully orchestrated tears and the tragic tale of a young wife lost to senseless violence. But illusions, no matter how intricately woven, can only hold up for so long. Bit by bit, Babis's meticulously crafted world began to unravel. Each piece of evidence the investigators uncovered, every knot, every missing clue, every lie revealed in Caroline's own words, had chipped away at the facade. The tragic hero he had played for the world had been a role, one he had perfected to the last detail. But now, that role was over. The FBI, initially swayed by his emotional pleas and shaken by the supposed brutality of the crime, had mobilized to catch the fictitious killers he described. They had invested time, resources, and public sympathy to bring justice to a grieving husband. Yet all the while, the real culprit had stood right in front of them, hidden in plain sight. Babis had outmaneuvered them, toying with their compassion, exploiting their trust. And for a time, he'd succeeded. But no lie, no matter how perfectly executed, could withstand the truth forever. When the final pieces of evidence were laid bare, Babis's expression shifted from shock to something darker, a fleeting smirk, as though amused that his grand deception had finally been revealed. For the first time, the detectives saw him for what he truly was. Beneath the charm, beneath the mask of grief, lay a cold, calculating mind, a man who had turned his own tragedy into a performance, manipulating everyone who'd believed in him. As he was led away in handcuffs, a silence fell over those who had once pitied him. Reporters who had once painted him as a hero now looked on with disbelief. Babis Anopolis, the loving husband who had won the heart of a young girl and captivated a nation, was a man capable of unimaginable deceit. His facade had crumbled, and what lay beneath was the dark, chilling reality of a man who had fooled the world. In the wake of his downfall, the world stood stunned, left to reconcile the image of the man they'd once mourned with the monster he'd turned out to be. And for those who had believed in him, trusted him, and shed tears for him, there was only one question left: how could anyone have hidden such darkness behind such a perfect mask? It was a deception that shocked the world. A betrayal that went far beyond love, costing a young woman her life and revealing the chilling lengths one man would go to hide his own darkness. As news of Babis Anopolis' arrest spread like wildfire, headlines screamed across newspapers and illuminated screens alike. The once admired pilot, who had captured hearts with his tale of tragic love, was now a pariah, a cautionary tale of betrayal and deceit. In the days that followed, the investigation unraveled the full extent of his manipulation. Authorities unearthed a web of lies so intricately spun that it left even seasoned detectives in disbelief. Babis had not only silenced Caroline but had crafted an entire narrative to distract from his guilt, painting himself as the victim while orchestrating the ultimate betrayal. The deeper they dug, the more horrifying truths emerged, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Witnesses came forward, recounting their encounters with Babis in the months leading up to Caroline's death. Friends who once marveled at their seemingly perfect relationship began to question everything they thought they knew. Whispers of arguments, jealousy, and a volatile temper crept into conversations. The young couple who had seemed so in love now appeared like a mirage, one that had concealed Babis's true nature all along. Amidst the chaos, Caroline's family struggled to comprehend the betrayal of the man they had welcomed into their lives. They had seen Babis as a son, a protector of their beloved daughter, and yet he had betrayed them in the most unimaginable way. The grief they felt was compounded by anger and disbelief, a raw, unyielding pain that echoed through every corner of their existence. The trial became a media spectacle, drawing in spectators hungry for the details of this dark drama. As the prosecution laid out its case, each piece of evidence painted a chilling portrait of a man who had turned love into a weapon. Babis's charisma had been a facade, behind it lay manipulation and malice. The prosecution revealed text messages and social media posts that contradicted his claims, illustrating how he had been planning Caroline's demise long before that fateful night. But it wasn't just Babis who stood trial. The very institution of love, trust, and family faced scrutiny. How had the world been so easily deceived? How had love turned to tragedy, leaving a young woman dead and a community shattered? Each witness testimony resonated with pain, an echo of the betrayal that had unfolded behind closed doors. As the verdict approached, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. People held their breath, hoping for justice, desperate for closure. When the gavel finally fell, the courtroom erupted into chaos, a tumult of emotions swirling through the air. Babis was found guilty, his carefully constructed lies dismantled piece by piece, and the truth laid bare. The sentence was severe, a reflection of the gravity of his crimes and the life he had taken. Yet, even in conviction, the shadows of betrayal lingered. As the world moved on, many would still struggle to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who had emerged. Caroline's story became a haunting reminder of the depths of deception, a cautionary tale that would echo in the hearts of many. In the wake of the verdict, as the dust settled, a sense of resolve emerged. Caroline's family vowed to honor her memory by advocating for others who found themselves trapped in toxic relationships, ensuring her story wouldn't fade into silence. It became a rallying cry for those seeking to shed light on the often hidden struggles of love and loss. And while Babis Anopolis would spend his days behind bars, the legacy of his betrayal would resonate far beyond his prison walls, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the facade of love, a lesson that would echo through generations to come. As we've seen, the depths of the criminal mind can be darker than we ever imagined. But there's always more to uncover. Join us next time as we dive even deeper into stories that challenge everything we think we know about human nature. If you're ready to face the unsettling truths and explore the minds behind the headlines, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. Because trust me, things are only getting darker from here on Inside the Criminal Mind.